Thank you for your patience. I have returned.
Great. I'm glad you're back. So we're good to launch this then, Philip?
Yes, I have already made you the presenter.
Okay.
The session is already in recording mode, and we have 4 people that are on.
Okay. And can they hear us at this point?
I am assuming so.
Okay. Well, folks, if you all can hear my voice.
I'm going to unmute the people who are in attendance.
Welcome, everyone. If your phones are unmuted, if you would just kind of let us know that you're on the line, that would be great.
We're on the line.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, this is Fresno American Indian Health Project. Our board of directors are here listening.
Oh, great. So you have a conference speakerphone there?
Yes.
Terrific. Is there anyone else on the line?
Kim Gagnon with Indian Family Health in Great Falls, Montana.
Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Hi, Tony. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, this is TJ from NACA, Native Americans for Community Action in Flagstaff,
how are
Arizona. Good, thanks.
Glad you could join us. We'll give this maybe just one more minute and we'll begin. There are some other folks registered. I believe they will be joining us. And it sounds like out in Fresno, there's a group of people on a speakerphone that will be participating as well. So I would invite you all to please feel free to kind of join in and jump in here whenever you feel like you need to. We'll do this maybe 30 more seconds and then I'll begin it.
Tony, I have 4 of the registered 10 participants logged in.
Great. In one of those, there's actually a group of folks, I think, in Fresno, so it's not just one person.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Okay, well, I think it's okay if we begin. If some other folks join us, they will. Would remind folks, if you would, to please put your phone on mute, and that'll avoid all kind of unanticipated background noise. But remember that if you have a comment or a question, remember to unmute your phone, and please feel free to throw out any questions or comments anytime in this presentation. My name is Tony Scucci. I live in Portland, Maine, and I am been working in the nonprofit world for many years. But I do a lot of work around board development and board training, and have worked with NCUIH for several years now, and with many of the NCUIH member organizations doing board trainings. And I've also done some work around board training and strategic planning with the National Indian Health Board and some other groups as well that are related to Native communities. Last year with NCUIH, we developed a series of 3 webinars on board training. And we did that because we wanted to make sure we made it as easy as possible for board members from around the whole network of urban programs to be able to kind of connect in at their convenience to learn more about how to be more effective boards. And so we did that, and that was really very successful based on our evaluation. So this year we've set up a series of 6 webinars. Today's webinar is the 4th in that series. Today we're going to talk about executive transition management. We talk about ways in which you can help your organization weather the sometimes stormy period when an executive director leaves. And executive directors leave inevitably. We'll talk about that process some today. And we're also going to talk about it in a way that really comes from the perspective of the board of directors for the most part. What boards can do to prepare for this. How boards can manage through these transitional periods so they come out on the other end, taking full advantage of the opportunities that really do present themselves during this transition period. We will not spend a lot of time talking about how this might be from the executive director's perspective necessarily, We could always do an entire webinar on that if there were enough executives interested in that topic, and probably set it up just for executives. We're also not going to spend a lot of time talking about search process and hiring. And again, that's a whole other topic which we could always set up for a subsequent webinar. And I mention that because at the end of this webinar, Philip will post a link where you can access our survey to give us feedback about today's webinar, but also to suggest ideas for topics which you think might be relevant and important to you in your various communities. I hope to make this session as interactive as possible. It's a little bit challenging on the phone with many voices, but I will do my best to create opportunities for that. Really like to draw on your experiences and invite you all to share your stories as they may relate to this topic. And to also invite you to kind of consider me a resource even after this webinar. My website, my email is posted right here, and it'll be posted on the last slide as well. Please feel free to reach out to me after this call at any time if you have any questions or comments or would like some additional resources. I have a lot of stuff at my disposal that I'd be glad to share with you all. Also want to thank Philip for being the technical guru here. He's the one that makes sure that this happens technically, and if it weren't for him, I would not know what to do with all this modern equipment. So thank you, Philip, for setting up this and for being the tech support person behind all this. Finally, let me say that this webinar, like all the others, will be archived on the website at NCUIH. So if you know anyone who missed this webinar and would like to kind of catch up or would like to use this webinar as part of a training in your own respective organizations, I think you'll have access to it and be able to do that. So let me just pursue down. We'll just kind of shift into gear here. Okay, where are we? Look at the goal for today. And what we're hoping to do today is really to talk about strategies and tools to guide your boards through executive transitions. And again, keeping in mind that executive transitions really are inevitable. They do happen. And the idea behind this webinar is to make sure that you can have your organization as well prepared as possible to manage those transitions. So our objectives, the things we want to accomplish here, encourage participants to begin thinking about and planning the inevitable. So this is the opportunity to really begin thinking about that and planning. Also to identify the obstacles to planning and preparation. Even folks that have a new executive director, you might want to consider having some kind of succession plan in place. The idea of being prepared for things that can happen unexpectedly. So there are times when executives leave in planful ways, and there are times when they leave in ways that are not particularly planful. All the more reason to be prepared for these kinds of things. And here's our agenda, the way we'll kind of approach this topic. I kind of just giving you kind of a brief overview of the session. We're going to look at developmental tasks of organizations as they go through this transitional period. And we'll also look at some of the things you can expect and the things that get in the way. Just as a curiosity, if you would unmute your phones for a minute, and how many of you all on this call actually have an executive transition management plan or a succession plan in place now? Does anyone have such a plan in place?
Not that I'm aware of.
It's not uncommon. Most organizations don't approach this until they really have to. So we can look at some of the reasons for that and look at ways to overcome those obstacles. We'll then touch on something that I think would be helpful, which is there are these 3 stages that you want to move your organization through during the transitional period. So that we'll touch on that. Talk a little bit about succession planning. This won't be an extensive webinar on succession planning, but we'll incorporate succession planning into the process. Some things to be cautious about as you manage through your transitions. We'll talk a little bit about a search process, because part of the transition is, in effect, saying goodbye to the outgoing executive and welcoming in a new one, which means you need to find that new one. And so, so going through that process, having a good set of guiding principles is helpful in that process. And then we'll take a little time to evaluate this session. As I said, towards the end, Philip will post a link to I think it's a SurveyMonkey or some kind of very brief, simple questionnaire. If you could respond to that once we're done, And please provide your feedback, positive, negative. Tell us whether this was of value to you, what we could do to make these webinars more valuable, and as I said earlier, any ideas for future topics. So this is where we're going. Everybody's okay with that? I'm going to assume. And we'll move on, and we'll look at these developmental tasks. So if you think about this, it's just like human beings. We go through these developmental stages, and going through a transitional period, you'll go through these developmental periods as well. And they come sequentially. So the first thing you do when an executive leaves or informs the board that he or she is leaving, or in a case where the executive is fired by a board or a contract ends or whatever, the first thing you do is you want to come to terms with your own history as an organization. So there's a value to looking at your strengths and your weaknesses, things you've accomplished as an organization, and really just kind of stepping back and taking this opportunity to really take stock of who we are now and where we've come. This transitional period, it's also kind of a unique time to really shape the future by really kind of looking at who we are and where we want to be going into the future. So as you can see, you kind of take a moment to reflect back and then begin thinking about who we are now and who we need to be and where we need to go, what we need to think about in terms of our future direction. Another developmental task is making leadership or operational changes. When you're going through this transition, often it's a good time to rethink how we're organized, how we're structured, and is this a good time for us to rethink that and look for more effective or efficient ways to structure ourselves. Renewing linkages is another area. When a leader leaves, when an executive director leaves, not only do they leave as a person and their skills leave, but what you also experience often is a loss of all the linkages they've made for your organization, the relationships they've built with partners in the community, for example, relationships they have built with funders, with the mass media. And so this is a time to really renew all those linkages and make new connections with them as well. And then this other developmental task is committing to the new leadership and the new direction. It's important to keep in mind that once you hire a new executive, that's not the end. It's really kind of the beginning. And boards sometimes get into trouble when they go through a really good process. They identify a great executive, they bring that person in, and they don't, in a very intentional way, continue guiding and supporting that person, helping them to get in and up to speed. The more you do that, the quicker the person can get up to speed and bring more value to the organization. So those are kind of developmental tasks that you go through. Now, there are really 5 things that you can expect if you're going to weather this kind of transition. One is that your organization will change. If you've had an executive director for 10 or 15 years and he or she leaves, your organization will change. Even if you've had an executive who's been there for a shorter time, your organization will change. Changing in leadership really involves 3 phases. One is conducting a positive farewell experience for everybody. So how do we make this as positive an ending as possible? The next phase is to really launch the search, and simultaneously to be looking at taking time to really reflect on the organization. So, as I said earlier, it's kind of like taking stock, looking at the present and the past, but also looking at the future, and then ensuring that successful transition for the new executive, which means once the person is hired, to make sure that you're there to support him or her in their new job. And towards the end of the webinar, I have a list of some ways in which boards have done that in the past that you might find helpful. The third fact around weathering this leadership change is that you have to consider your interim leadership structure. If an executive director leaves and you don't have somebody kind of waiting in the wings and stepping in immediately, you have to think about how will we manage this interim period, what kind of leadership structure should we have in place for that. The fourth of the 5 facts around weathering this transition is that a search is much more than an ad in the paper. If you have an executive director and he or she informs you that you're leaving, if the first thing you do is to pull out the old job description and post it in the newspaper, you're missing a great opportunity and to really look at your organization and make the most of this transition. Plus, you'll find often that organizations that do that, where they quickly replace an executive with somebody else, over time you'll see that person leave and another one comes, and over time that person leaves another, and you end up with a series of executives, partly because the board didn't do a good enough job of assessing where it is and what it needs in leadership going forward. And the last kind of fact, if you want to weather these kind of leadership changes, you don't want to throw that new leader into the fray. You really want to help that person kind of transition in. Very few of you all on the call have really attended to planning for transitions. Many, you're in a lot of company with that. I wonder, just if you all unmute your phones, what thoughts you may have about, from a board perspective, for example, why it is that boards simply don't pay attention to this. What do you think the reasons might be behind that? What might be a reason if you haven't, as a board or as a board member or as an executive, what might be a reason that you haven't really attended to this?
Sure. One of the things is that you are comfort in a comfort zone, and you can't really see beyond that zone or that box to look for changes.
I think you're absolutely right. That's one of the most common kind of explanations for this. People tend to stay where they're comfortable. When we move into areas where we're a little uncomfortable, we start to get anxious, and so there's a natural kind of tendency to avoid things that make us anxious. Any other thoughts? I'll share with you some of the thoughts that I've heard and I've gleaned from my work with lots of nonprofit boards. When you think about it from a board level, a lot of time board chairs are in a place for only 2 or 3 years, and they may not really see issues that go beyond that kind of period of time. Boards who often do not effectively evaluate their executive. One of the things that I find is where your board, if your board has an effective performance review process for your executive director, it creates a context to talk about all kinds of things, including planning for leaving. And how can we do that? How can we position our organization so it's not vulnerable during these critical transitional periods of time? So if you have an executive performance review process in place, it really serves as a good context for having those conversations. The emotional tension regarding succession planning may result from avoidance. That's what whoever made that comment earlier. I mean, that's kind of what it is. We tend to avoid or procrastinate. That's what kind of happens from a board level. If you look at it from the executive level, very often executives may feel compelled to address urgent issues. Executives are often so busy in dealing with the things that are right in front of them, that are pressing concerns, that they simply don't have the time or think about the more long-term effects of them leaving. They may also have concerns about why, when, and how to step down. Sometimes executives aren't sure about how to do that. In my work, I find there are often executives who really don't know how, they don't know when, for themselves personally and professionally, it's a good time to step down. Often they may feel threatened by the subject. If your board and your executive even start having conversations about what do we do when you leave, that's a healthy thing because it brings down that feeling of anxiety and feeling threatened by the subject. The other thing I point out here is that there may be a belief on the part of the executive that your organization is so complicated and so complex that it's somehow not going to be able to manage without you. And without sounding too crass, it's really helpful for executives, and I'm speaking as a former executive, to always remind yourself that, the bottom line is it's just a job. There are lots of people who could do this job. And in a humble way to kind of not think that you are so important that you can't leave. A time will come when you'll feel like it's the right thing to do for you, where the board will feel it's the right time for it to happen, and you want to be able to act on that, not let things get in the way of it. So those are some reasons. Knowing when to leave, and this is now a little bit on from the perspective of an executive director. How as an executive director, this is a personal decision, and it's also kind of an organizational decision. What do you think, and you can unmute your phones if you will, what do you think are some indicators that would suggest to an executive it's time for me to leave? What are some things that an executive might be looking out for or attending to, some indicators that it's time for me to move on?
Programs. Not implementing.
Could you repeat that, please?
Being stagnant.
When things feel stagnant, yeah.
Yeah. Change in family growth.
Change in family growth. You mean personal family?
Personal family.
Yeah. So sometimes sometimes your family demands some time or attention from you that you cannot give when you're in your current position. Yep. Others? Are there any folks on the phone who've been executives who left?
Maybe the pay wasn't well, the money wasn't good enough, or
so just a dissatisfaction, leaving because it just didn't feel like it was worth the effort, that you were working harder and bringing more value than you were being compensated for. Sure.
Moving, relocation, moving, transition.
Transitions, moving, getting relocated, certainly. All these are kind of, when you're attending to these things, they help give you some indication of when you might really think about leaving. Some other executives have said things like, you know, I keep returning to this thought that the organization needs to go someplace and I'm not the right person to get it there. I mean, it takes somebody who can really kind of put their ego to the side and step back and accept the fact that, you know, the organization is moving in a particular way. I don't really have the skill sets or the ability to kind of be the leader in that direction. That's an indicator that it might be time to leave. I'm burned out and I know it. You know, very often executives find themselves just overwhelmed and everything starts falling apart in their lives. You know, if you start feeling like I'm burned out and I know it, well, that might be a time to leave. I don't think I'm burned out, but other people think I am. Often you don't realize it when you're under so much stress until you ask other folks for feedback and get some input into how they see you. And when other people think you're burned out, if anyone, you know, suggests to you that you're acting like you're burned out, you might want to just kind of reflect on that and think about, yeah, there may be something to that. I can't stand my board anymore, or I can't seem to please the board no matter what I do. When you have a relationship with your board and it just doesn't seem to be able to go anywhere anymore, that would be an indication that it might be time to leave. My clock is ticking. You know, sometimes you leave because it's time to leave. You're getting older, moving on professionally to another level. Someone mentioned family roles are calling me. One of the things that happens to executives who do not do a good job of balancing their personal life and their professional life is that one of those things starts going down the tunnel, down the tubes. So when your family calls, your family ought to come first, at least in my opinion. I have a burning desire to do something. When you really feel like you're in a position where, you know, I've been an executive for 10 years and there's something else I want to do with my life, and I keep coming back to me, and in order to do it, I need to leave this position. Those are some indicators when it might be a time to leave. Do you all have any comments or thoughts about what I've talked about so far and what we've discussed? Okay, well, let me talk about now these, where am I here? These three key words, and these words are really important to keep in mind because there are three kind of things you do, or three stages you go through when you go through this transition. And let me also point out that transitional periods are very, very difficult. They're very stressful. And we go through transitions all the time. We go through many transitions in our day-to-day life. We get better at going through them because we practice. But transition periods are difficult periods. You know this right away if you ever go into a Head Start program or a preschool program, and you notice what happens to children's behaviors when they move from going to some structured activity to play to nap time to a structured activity. You find that in those transitional periods they have a little more difficulty managing themselves because they're stressful times. Same thing with organizations. So there are three kind of ways to think about this, three things to think about. One is that you want to get yourself in a position where you're prepared. Being prepared is one. Pivot. So you're prepared for an executive transition well in advance of it. The transition comes to your doorstep. Your organization has a chance to pivot, actually turn in a fundamental way, and then from that turning, move into a new direction where it really can thrive. So prepare, pivot, and thrive. And this comes from a man named Don Tebbe, and if you really want to know a lot more about this stuff, I think if you Google that name, you'd probably get a lot of good resource information. He's somebody who's done a lot of work around executive transitions. What we'll do in the next 3 slides is talk about these 3 key words. So in terms of preparing, you really want to exploit the opportunities that this provides. And it's a real investment to do that, but if you can invest that up front, there's a payback to that. And being prepared really ensures that the organization is stable enough to make a good hire. You want to be in a good position so when you go through this process to hire, and I will tell you it's the most important decision you'll ever make as a board, hiring an executive director. This is your key resource person. You want to be in a position where you're able to do that well, where you clearly understand your organization, you have a good sense of what your future leadership needs are going to be, you know, what kind of person in terms of skills and in terms of personal qualities are going to get you moving in that direction. And that, you know, all this information is captured in a job profile and a solid plan for search and transition. It puts it all together. You can have all that stuff in place in terms of preparing for this. One of the things I'll touch on in a little bit is the kind of principles that can guide you in going through this process as well. And then we come to that second word, pivot. This is the kind of moment when action happens. Board really should not focus exclusively on the search. You really want to focus your attention not only on the search, but focus your attention inward as well. What can the organization do to pave the way for greater success? This is a good question to ask before you ever begin a search. What can we as a board and what can our organization do to pave the way? In most organizations, there are legacy issues. There are things that are left unattended, things that have not been addressed. And you want to make sure that those things, if they're really important, are addressed before the executive comes on into his or her new position. Identify issues and set corrective actions into motion before new executives are hired. I can't tell you how many times executive directors have said to me, you know, I was hired, and when I came in, I found all kinds of stuff I had no idea I was going to find. Not the best formula for success. So that's the kind of pivot period. Then you have the thriving segment of this. Simple things that you can do to make sure that the impact is reduced, that the organization is not distressed any more than it has to be. Providing solid orientation, helping that executive really get into place and begin leading. Agreed upon set of priorities for the first 12 to 18 months. When you hire a new executive, it's really important to be clear about what are the 3 or 4 or 5 most important things that have to be attended to in the very near future, and make sure there's clarity about that so the executive knows what's expected of him or her. Build a strong social contract between the board and the executive. When you bring in a new executive, now you have to build brand new relationships. Individual board members with that executive, the board as a body with that executive, all the staff that report to that executive, all these relationships have to be forged. And that means being clear about roles and responsibilities and what everyone expects of each other. And the last segment in here, establishing performance monitor mechanisms. So you want to have something in place to be able to evaluate performance. I always encourage boards, when you hire somebody, it's at the moment of hire, you already want to know what your evaluation process is going to be. The new executive has to know what he or she will be evaluated on. Often that doesn't happen, but that is the time to make sure you have a good performance review and tool and process at the time of hire. Makes really good sense when you think about it. Very difficult to have all your ducks lined up that way in order to do that, though. Talk a little bit about succession planning. And succession planning is something, it simply means being prepared for who will take leadership next. And it's important, if you really want to look out for the best interests of your organization, to plan your leadership in very intentional ways. There are three kind of ways in which succession planning happens. One has to do with emergencies. Things come up. People leave unexpectedly as an emergency. Sometimes the departure of the executive is defined. An executive director will say, I'm planning on leaving in the next 6 months. So between now and that time, me and the board, we can sit down and come up with a good plan for how we can make that the smoothest transition possible. And then there's the strategic leadership development. There are opportunities in succession planning for those other senior managers, other staff who may have the capacity to grow into a leadership role for their staff. So those are kind of three elements of succession planning. And the emergency one really applies even if you hire an executive tomorrow. It would be well worth it to think about, what do we do in case something happens to this person, something drastic, God forbid, but these things do happen. And the reason you do all this planning is to make sure you're looking out for your organization and protecting your organization, which is the fundamental work of a board of directors. How do executives leave? What do you when you look around your own experiences, what you've heard, how do executives leave? What are the ways that executives leave? There's one. There's one. Fired. Yeah, I just heard somebody say that. Executives leave. Sometimes they're fired. There are times when and retired. That's another one, certainly. And a retired leaving is one of those planful leavings, or it can be. And if there's enough honesty and trust between the executive and the board so they can talk about that, that's one of those situations where the executive can say, I'm going to retire very shortly. Let's start talking about my successor. And then really think about what are the best ways to manage through that period. Executives get fired by boards. This is not uncommon, and it's a difficult thing for a board to fire an executive, and it has to be done in a way that certainly has justification and done in a way that's respectful. But boards often have to fire an executive because, in their opinion and their assessment, it'd be better for that person to be gone, be better for the organization, better for the people we serve. So being fired is one way that executives leave. They leave unexpectedly. Sometimes the executive will say to the board, I'm out of here in 2 weeks, or I'm going to give you a 1 month notice, but I'm gone. That's another way executives leave. They leave in a planful way, as the woman just said on the line. Sometimes it's somebody's retiring and they can plan for that retirement. They leave as a result of some emergency. Again, these are kind of things that can happen, kind of help explain how they leave. So if we look at the key elements here, the work of the board is to ensure that there's an appropriate departure. And appropriate means, in my opinion, if firing is the appropriate departure, then it's firing. If it's a more planful kind of more positive leaving, again, it still has to be done in a way you ensure that you do it well, that you do it appropriately. You want to advance the agency's sustainability through all this. Preparing stakeholders. Everyone, when an executive leaves, everyone who has a stake in that person in that position has to be prepared somehow. Identifying the future leadership needs. So, you really want to take this opportunity to look forward and think about what kind of leader do we need going forward. If you have an executive that you hired 10 or 15 years ago, there's a good chance it was a different board that actually did that hiring. But even if it was your board, the hiring you did 10 or 15 years ago and what your needs were in terms of leadership, have changed. There's no doubt about that because everything changes in those periods of time. Recruiting, hiring successfully, orienting a new director. So it's another element. So these are the elements of an effective executive transition. And I point out these two little subcategories down here. Accurate job description. It is done in the context of a performance tool and process, and having that in place, and have it in place at the time of hire. If you have a good performance review process on an annual basis, you'll be asking your executive as part of that process, to review the job description and revise it. Make sure it accurately reflects the work of the executive director, because you need that information when you begin the process of hiring. So those are the kind of elements of the process. I put together a kind of a checklist. So this is something you might ask yourself. These are questions you might ask yourself. What we need to have in place to make sure that we are doing the best we can as stewards of our organization. We're prepared for an executive leadership transition. One of the things you want to do is to make sure you have some kind of strategic plan in place. If you have a strategic plan in place, it puts you in good stead. Board evaluates your executive director annually. I said this 2 or 3 times now. If you do an annual performance review, that's another thing you want to have in place, because it positions your organization to go through this transition as smoothly as possible. That the board is doing its job. You want to make sure that as a board, on a regular basis, you're assessing your own performance and making sure that you're attending to your part of the job. Senior management is a high-performing team. If your program is large enough to have many employees and senior management level people, you want to make sure that those folks are functioning as a team, because they're going to lose their team leader and replace that team leader with someone else. And having in place a team that functions well as a team is a very helpful thing. Another staff person or board member shares important external relationships. And I mentioned earlier that one of the things you lose when an executive leaves are the relationships he or she has cultivated and managed with folks outside of your organization. Sharing responsibilities for others having those kind of relationships is a good way to ensure that you're in a good position. Financial reserve is in place. I don't know how many of you have an operating reserve, but it would probably be a good thing if you do, and it puts your organization in a good position to manage these kind of leadership transitions. Having a financial reserve it's just a healthy thing to have anyhow. You have good financial systems in place. I can tell you that one of the things executives often say to me when they start a new job is that I had no idea how much of a mess the books were. The financial systems really were outdated, not suitable for the organization, lots of problems around that. So if you as a board ensure that you've got good systems in place, you're going to minimize the disruption of the transition. And that key staff people can do lots of other jobs. I mean, this is, I think, is kind of a notion that people may understand of cross-training. If everyone on your leadership team has a pretty good idea what each other does and can do some of that, and they share that responsibility, it makes the transition period much easier. Thoughts or comments about anything I've said so far? Please feel free to unmute your phone. Okay, I'm going to move along. And this stuff comes from Compass Point, by the way, so it's another good resource. If you Google that, you'll get a lot of access to a lot of good information. If you're dealing with an executive transition, in my mind, there are really 5 options that you have. One option is to assess, really take the time to stop and look at our organization. Who are we now? Where are we going? What are we going to need? You can assess and begin a search simultaneously. So you can do that with or without external consultant or consultants. So one option is to just do both these steps, assessing and searching simultaneously. Another option is to do them sequentially. So we take some time, we assess our organization, we assess the field in which we're working, and we look at what we may need, and then you move to identifying what you look for in the qualities and qualifications of an executive. So that's a sequential way of doing it. Another option is to designate someone internally to act as the executive. And you can assess and do that. When you do this, temporarily, that person, whoever is the acting, is going to assume dual responsibilities. So if you have a second in command, for example, and you ask that person to serve as the executive during this interim period, well, who's going to do that person's job what they haven't done? You've got to think about those things, but that's another option that you have. A fourth option in going through this is to contract with an interim executive to stabilize and guide the assessment and the transition. So there's the assessment and the transition. Now, there are some people who are external consultants who come in and have expertise in both areas. You could bring in some person in the role, they'd have dual roles. They do the assessment and they guide the assessment and guide the transition. You could also have two people and split the work up that way. And the fifth option, the last option really, is to contract with an interim to really just keep the shop open and make difficult decisions. And you would just put off thinking about hiring an executive director for a while. You might do that because your organization needs to do some other work and be better prepared before you hire someone full-time. A lot of times organizations will do this when you've had an executive director for a long time and the board and the organization is so dependent on that person, and they are really, they have assumed so much of the leadership of the organization that when they leave, it's very difficult to find somebody who can kind of step in their shoes. So when you have a situation where an executive has been around for a while, it's always good to consider the idea of creating some space and time before you hire a full-time person to follow that person. Things you might want to be aware of as you go through this process. And these are things that I've seen in my experiences. One of the things you want to avoid doing is to focus on replacing a person. You really want to focus on assessing. What is it that we need? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? So the emphasis is not on how do we replace this person, but how do we get a better picture of who we are and what we need? Another tendency is to undertake without sufficient guidance or competency. If you are a board of directors and you're going through a process to hire a new executive director, if you really do not have the competency or experience to be able to do that well, it makes good sense to work with someone who does. This is one of the most important decisions you'll ever make. You want to make sure you make it with the best guidance and expertise possible. Acting too quickly. You don't want to do this in a quick way. You don't want to rush. And there is a tendency to rush. There's a tendency to feel like, oh my God, our executive director's leaving. We better get somebody to fill that position. You really want to do this in a deliberative way. I've worked with boards where they assume that the second in command is qualified and that the second in command wants to do the job. And I can tell you numerous times where board assumed the second in command wanted to do the job, and I talked to the second in command, and she says, no way I want that job. So we've got to be careful about making these assumptions. The other is that assuming that a second in command is qualified. Some people are really can excel at being second in command. That doesn't necessarily mean they can excel at being the leader, the primary leader. And you see this in all fields. The job of an executive director is different than the job of any other person in the organization. Dusting off the old job description. If you're using the old job description and you're not looking forward, you're not really considering what we need going forward, you're much more focused on the past. So you really want to avoid doing that. Not doing due diligence. The whole notion of let's get a sense of what kind of condition our organization is in right now. Where are we in terms of our programs, in terms of our finances? Making sure that you have a good handle on that. You want to make sure that you do. Overcompensating for weaknesses is another area. Very often in an organization, you'll have an executive director with some key strengths and one or two weaknesses. And when that person leaves, there's a tendency to kind of hire somebody to compensate for the weaknesses the person leaving had. It's usually not a good formula. Again, it's not a complete or comprehensive way of looking at what you actually do need. Hiring an executive, there's a tendency to settle. If it starts taking a long time, if you conduct a search and you're not real successful, oops, what did I do here? My apologies. You don't want to settle. It's just like hiring anybody for any position. If you settle, you're going to end up with problems down the road. So much better to make sure you feel good about the person you're going to bring on. Think the work is done at the time of hire. Again, there's a tendency to think, okay, we spent so much time and energy going through this process. Now we have somebody, we really like him or her. We feel like this is the right leader for us. Now we're done. If that's the case, you not do as much as you could to really help that person get grounded and off to a good start. And just the notion of not seeing the opportunities in this, there really is a great opportunity when leadership changes for a lot of different reasons. One of the things that a new executive is going to bring to your organization that the outgoing executive cannot bring, and that's newness. And sometimes newness is exactly what you need. So these are some tendencies you might want to think about and make sure you resist these tendencies if you start feeling like we're moving in those directions. Some guidelines I just put up here briefly for you all to consider when you think about doing an executive search. And these are kind of basic things that I have found with nonprofit boards that by getting clear about what the principles are that will guide our work, you've got to do that right up front. So these are some principles that other boards have come up with. One is that they make a commitment that if we're going to do this search, the whole board is going to participate. We're not going to say to 2 or 3 board members, you take responsibility for this. Now, you may have a committee of some kind that takes a lead responsibility, but the full board has to participate. It's a full board decision. You do not want an executive committee or a small group of people to make this decision. This is the decision that the full board ought to make, and it ought to be fully informed. The full board is going to live with this decision, so they ought to be part of the whole thing. Many boards I work with, they make a decision up front that they're going to hire by consensus. And the thinking behind that is, you know, if we have 6 people on our board that support this candidate and 4 people that don't, that creates an untenable situation for the new person coming in. And I know if I were if I were a candidate coming into an organization where the board was split 60-40 on whether they had confidence in me being the next leader, I would not take the position. So it's one of those cases where the full board has to be able to say, yeah, we think this is the best person for the job, and we can all support that decision, and we all commit to get behind that person. Respecting the privacy of all applicants. It's really important to be very conscious when people are applying for this kind of a position that you respect their privacy. No one should know who's applying unless they should know. There are certain people for whom that information is very important and relevant, and for many people, it's none of their business. But trying to protect people's privacy is a good thing. Don't rush the process, as I said earlier. It's a tendency to rush it because you want to get through it, because you're tired, because you worked hard at this. You don't want to rush the process. Full disclosure. Sometimes if you're sitting on a board and someone applies for the executive director position, it may be someone you know. There's nothing either good or bad about that. What matters is that everyone agrees that if I know this candidate in some other setting, I have a responsibility to share that with everyone. That I have a responsibility to say, I know so-and-so because he's my daughter's teacher. Well, when he was her teacher, or he ran an agency where I worked at some point. Being open and honest about that is really helpful. That a person on the board knows somebody in a more personal way is, again, it can be a positive or a negative depending on how you handle it. A person who on the board who knows a candidate personally can share some insights about that person that you may not be able to get any other way. At the same time, you want to just take that into account, and that person who really has that personal knowledge should probably recuse themselves from the process at some point. Sharing responsibility throughout. This is a responsibility that everyone should share. It's a major undertaking for a board, and there are major consequences to getting it right or getting it wrong. Commitment to be open, honest, and direct. You've got to do this in a way at some level where the board sits down and you start talking about candidates, you're talking about people. It's going to get personal. You have to do it in a way that's honest and respectful, but you have to be direct and honest about it. Keeping the best interest of the organization and the clientele paramount. I mean, you want to make sure that the decision that you make is going to be something that everyone feels like this is in the best interest of our organization and the people we serve. And the final one, guiding principle, is don't settle. If you go through a strenuous process and you settle and you have 2 or 3 candidates and you go through an interview process and realize, you don't really feel that good about any of them, even though it means reopening the search or taking some other action and delaying the decision and having to work longer and harder, even though that may be the result, It's far better than to settle for somebody. So those are some guidelines that I have kind of developed from work I've done with other boards. Let me share with you one other slide. This is an example of kind of ways in which you can get a new director off to on the right foot. So if you're in a position now where at some point in the near future you're going to be hiring an executive, these are some things to think about. One is you want to hang in there a little longer. Even though you're tired and you've gone through this process and now you've got the new executive, you just want to hang in a little longer to make sure that you're giving that person the support they need. Writing and sending out a press release. I mean, this is news. This is a way to communicate to the community that you've gone through a process. You've hired a new executive. You support this person in their work. You invite everyone in the community to get to know this person. It is news, and it can advance your organization's mission if you manage it well. Having the board president or the chair introduce the new executive to staff, sometimes that's a good way in larger organizations where the board chair would simply sit down with the staff and introduce him or her, the new executive, to the staff. Taking time at a board meeting to make a list of influential people. Who are the people, like if someone is new coming into your organization as your executive, who are some of the key people that person ought to get connected to? Make up a list. Give that person names. Make introductions. Build those bridges between this new person and the community in which he or she's going to be working. Making a personal donation to the organization now. It's a good way to demonstrate your confidence. Above everything else, you want to communicate as a board to the community that you have confidence in the person who's stepping into this new leadership role. Set the new executive up for success by giving them positive messages to the community. So I kind of touched on that. If you're the board chair, here's a couple things you can think about. Really taking some extra care, working with this executive in board meetings, and just looking for opportunities to kind of demonstrate your support and your confidence in the new hire. And as a board leader, if you do that, that has a kind of ripple effect as well. Suggesting to your executive that a good use of organizational funds may be to pay a coach. Sometimes bringing in a new executive is a good time to connect that executive up to an executive coach, somebody who can provide guidance and ongoing kind of learning and support for that person. I've done a lot of coaching work with executives, and when you hear the expression, you know, it's lonely at the top, it really is. And an executive director position is a place where there are some issues you grapple with that you can't go to your staff with and you can't go to your board with, and you don't have a coworker. Who do you go to? So the idea of considering a coach is something that many organizations find very effective and very useful. And you see this a lot in the for-profit world. People in the for-profit world really get it. They see that having a coach for their managers and executives is a worthwhile investment. We have this notion sometimes we think about somebody having a coach as if they have some deficits they need to correct. And that's not the case at all. I mean, just look at the sports metaphor. Michael Jordan had a coach. He probably wasn't a greater basketball player, but he still had a coach and used a coach and benefited from a coach. So that's kind of an example. Establish and monitor benchmarks for performance. It's really important for the new executive to know what are the markers here? What are the things that he or she needs to get to and accomplish in terms of their performance? How will they know how they're doing? Having that in place is really a good way to help get the person off to a good start. And this comes from Tim Wolf and Jen Masaoka. And those names, too, if you Google them, you will find a lot of good resources out there if you'd like more. And certainly, as I was saying earlier, please feel free to contact me after this call. If you have other comments or questions, or if you'd like to talk more, I am available and would gladly spend some time with you. We have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that people have an opportunity to throw out any questions or comments. So please unmute your phones, and if there's something you'd like to share with folks, please do. Anyone? Anything? Well, I'll put my email address up here again, and again, invite you to contact me. The next session, webinar, is going to be on November 19th, same time, same day of the week, on a Monday. And we're going to look at the kind of characteristics of boards that perform at a very high level. So we're going to look at highly effective boards in that webinar. And let me just also make a quick pitch that on December 10th, the last in the series will be on leadership. And that webinar is going to be designed for each board member, each board chair and executive director to participate as a team. So as you think about that and then talk to your friends and colleagues in the field, we really would like to have the executive director and the board chair of each organization that participates on the webinar. So those people in the dyad and kind of the two leaders, the board leader and the staff leader, and we'll talk about ways in which to really build a constructive partnership between the two. So that's where we are for now. Philip, I think, are you still there, Philip? Hello?
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry, I was on.
Okay. Okay, if you would mind just make it possible for folks to get to that link, that would be great. I want to thank you, Philip, again for doing all this behind-the-scenes work, and thank you to everyone who joined the call and participated. I appreciated your comments and participation, and have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you very much. It's been very helpful.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for posting that, Philip.
You're welcome.
So I think we're good here. Please, if you're still on the line, take the time and go to that SurveyMonkey link and give us your best honest feedback. Thank you all. Bye-bye.